This is Lou Elizondo, and you are listening to That UFO Podcast.
Hi everyone, and welcome back to That UFO Podcast. My name is Andy, and delighted to be joined on the show today by a professor at George Mason University and researcher at the Future of Humanity Institute at Oxford, Mr. Robin Hanson. Robin, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Very much looking forward to this, and ever so slightly nervous, Robin. As I mentioned before, I've listened to your interview with Lex Friedman twice, and some of that certainly went over my head. I think I got the gist of most of it, but I'm looking forward to the conversation and seeing where we go with it. Before we get to that, I want to take you back and ask you, what were some of your earliest memories of the subject of aliens, UFOs?
Well, UFOs haven't been much of my life at all. Obviously, I've always enjoyed science fiction, so the idea of aliens has been part of that. But that's usually in the context of some much larger timescales where our descendants might meet aliens in the distant future. I've never expected to meet aliens myself, nor have I paid that much attention in my lifetime to those who said they had.
So it was very much a passing interest. That obviously, we're going to get to the point of talking about having the website, the papers, and your interest that you've recently been on Lex Friedman, and millions of people are seeing you talk about alien civilizations. Is it something that you've really picked up in an academic form as you've kind of grown in years?
So one of my main intellectual strategies has just been to look for important neglected topics. And, somewhat early on, I noticed that even though the idea of aliens is obviously important, it seems somewhat neglected, at least among intellectuals. And that tempted me to dabble a bit more in it, to think about the overall, arc of history, from the origin of life to the rise of humans to where we might go in the distant future and become. That whole long-term arc just seems obviously important, but not that many academics or intellectuals really talk about it. So I did a little work thinking about that.
Why do you think it has been avoided by academia widely?
I think academics start out with the same sort of sense of what's important that everybody else has, but academics are selected for being able to be impressive in some way they can credential among themselves. That's really the product they sell. They don't sell just being people interested in interesting things. They sell, we have some special method or approach that lets us credibly, expertly say things on a topic that you couldn't say unless you knew our expert knowledge and methods. And therefore, academics search for topics where they can say such things. And so in most areas of academia, such as mine economics, most introductory courses are focused on all the things we think we can say. And then all the things we don't know much about or can't say, we usually just shut up about and try to pretend it doesn't exist.
And that's really interesting, because some people who, especially in the past, I would listen to podcasts or interviews of, where Professor Brian Cox, Neil deGrasse Tyson, and even astronaut Chris Hadfield have all recently been quite outspoken and at times derogatory about the subject of aliens and encompassing that UFOs in the mainstream media. As someone who isn't a scientist, quite clearly, like myself, is the basis of, these kind of, as a scientist, you want to explore and you want to find new things. And like you say, the idea of aliens and alien civilizations would be one of the greatest discoveries of all time. Why do you think, again, these very well-known people, is it the same sort of reasons you think they steer away from that conversation?
I think in general, we scientists try to follow an ideal concept of inference or drawing conclusions. And there's this idea of Bayesian inference, which is one of our mathematical models of it. And this formal theory of how we draw conclusions says that on each topic, we combine two things. We combine some prior probabilities of what seems plausible times some evidence of particular things we see and that might push us toward one conclusion or another. So in general, academics and everyone else, when we think of things like ghosts or fairies, then we ask, from our point of view of our basic theory, the other things we know about the world, how a priori plausible is it that there are, say, ghosts or fairies? And then we multiply that times any particular reports that people have seen, and try to ask, well, if that theory was true or some other theory was true, how likely is it that this sort of report would have been generated? And you're supposed to multiply those two things for each different theory and then renormalize over all the theories, and that's supposed to tell you what things to believe in. And so most intellectuals and academics on these topics, usually it's the priors that make them uninterested. So given everything else we know about, say, the universe, our prior on ghosts and fairies is really low. We think that's just crazy unlikely. And if your prior is low enough, then any particular evidence you see, will you say, yeah, that's kind of weird, but it's more likely that a weird thing was generated by an ordinary reality that just happened in some situation to come out looking weird than it would be to have been generated by an actual weird thing. So if we get to something like UFOs, many people would classify that as like ghosts or fairies. They would say, look, sure, if it were true, it'd be really interesting. But given everything else we know, it's so a priori unlikely that you just really can't take much evidence for it very seriously. Now, in the past, we've had things that were classified as like ghosts and fairies that have turned out now in the consensus to be true. So, for example, asteroids were once thought of as just crazy rocks couldn't be falling from the sky. Now we believe that's true. Ball lightning is something that people thought, well, that's pretty crazy, but then they generated it in the lab. And so people go, I guess it's real because we've made it in the lab. And then there are some very high level kinds of lightning that the first pilot saw, sort of octopus looking pink things way up high in the atmosphere. And pilots learned quickly to not report them because they didn't want to be thought of as crazy because they wanted to keep a pilot's license. And so nobody reported it for many decades until NASA put up a satellite and looked high in the atmosphere, and there it was, these big pink octopus-like lightning. So in the past, we have, on occasion, come across things that people had dismissed, and they were, revised. So then the question about UFOs is, how implausible is it from a priori considerations that there would actually be, real things behind this phenomenon? And that's where I think I have some expertise. And that's where I would weigh in on the topic. So I do not consider myself very expert on the particular sightings and the particular reports. I mean, I think to look at that, you need to know the weather. You need to be pilot expertise. You know the technology and equipment and the kinds of sensors. And those are the kind of things you should know about if you want to weigh in on the particular reports. And I've done sort of an amateur survey enough to say, well, there's, something to be taken seriously there. But I don't want to weigh in. The most thing I would say is when I've looked at the best evidence for, say, ghosts or fairies, I say that looks pretty weak. And when I look at UFOs, I go, that looks a lot stronger. I can't tell you how much stronger, but a lot stronger. More something to be taken seriously. But I'm not going to claim to be an expert there. I'm going to claim to be an expert on the prior. That is, how plausible is it on basic considerations that there would be some powerful creatures who could and would do the powerful, amazing things we seem to see with UFOs?
Let me ask you, and I want you to pick apart the way I sometimes, in my layman's terms, try and talk about this, and you can please do pull this apart if it's completely wrong. I've often said that when people talk about it, it would be almost impossible for another civilization to have technology to travel the distance required to visit us here on Earth, even if they did exist somewhere else. And I've often used the example that if people were standing on the shore long before we invented even boats or a method to sail, the traversing the oceans would have seemed impossible because we didn't have the sufficient craft or technology to do that. And isn't it just a case of that another civilization being sufficiently advanced could have developed those means and methods to travel distances that we once thought were incredibly, vast, but to them, because of how they do it, it's not? Or is that too simple?
In order for a scenario to be plausible, we need to think about all the different aspects of that scenario we can and ask whether that whole combination is plausible. So if, some scenario has a particular element. That particular element might seem plausible, but that doesn't mean the whole scenario is plausible. So if you say, assume the aliens, had crafts and they came to visit here, would they have doors in the crafts? And I go, well, yeah, I guess they probably have doors. And you might say, see, haha, this isn't so crazy. These people reported seeing a door in this thing. And I go, well, yeah, that part of the report isn't so crazy. Given that there's this thing here, sure, there's a door. But I might say, but the rest of the scenario you generated, that's the thing I might have a problem with, right? So you might say, couldn't there have been some civilization out there and, long ago, and they're much more advanced than they came here? And I'd say, sure, given that they're more advanced, then yeah, they could do more stuff than we did. But I need a whole scenario, a whole story that makes sense that includes that element. That's the harder part. So I think when most other academics are saying this sounds kind of crazy, it's the whole package that they're responding to.
So they're looking for the context, to fleshing it out. And to be fair, that's not a conversation I can have, and that's where it's better people like
yourself. I think you and I can have that conversation right now if you want. We can just go into it.
Yeah, well, do you know what? I've got some stuff that will come to that a bit more later on. Sure. So we'll park that because I do want to get to talking about your own work at the moment. And your conversation with Lex Friedman was fascinating. Like I said, I used the term layman. Some of the more mathematical conversations and equations went a bit over my head. I like to think I understood the gist of what was being discussed. I really liked the way you broke some of that conversation down, though. It didn't come across as condescending. And that's something I think even Lex himself commented on early in the interview, that he appreciated how you spoke about these terms and ideas, and not afraid to go into some conversations that others might steer away from. Can I ask you to first off explain the term Grabby Alien?
Sure. So when we look up in the sky, the universe looks empty, and we can draw some conclusions from that. That's data. It's data about one kind of alien, but not another. And I want to distinguish the two. So I will say it's data about the loud, but not the quiet aliens. So quiet aliens are out there a long way away. They're small, they're staying small, they don't last long, they're not doing much. They're really hard to see. So a big empty universe is consistent with a lot of quiet aliens out there. However, there's another kind of alien. This is an alien which, once it appears, starts to grow, expand rapidly, and then in the volume it touches, it changes that volume. It makes a big difference. That's the sort of thing life has done here on Earth, and humans are doing on Earth. That is, when we go places, we change things, and we make them look different. That's the kind of life and civilization that we don't see in the universe. And so loud aliens are what we're not seeing. And that's the data to think about. So Grabby aliens is our specific mathematical model of this more general idea of loud aliens. So Grabby is to connote this idea that they go out and grab stuff and they change it. And that we can confront with our observations, because that would make a big visible difference.
And by grabby, do you mean they'd be more likely to potentially be hostile or aggressive in their actions?
Not by definition, but you might guess that perhaps. But the key thing about them is they're grabbing and changing things, right? They aren't just visitors. They're not zookeepers. They're not gamesmen. They are developers and colonizers and changers. They go out into the universe and they take things and they do things with them that aren't consistent with their original uses and purposes. So one key idea of a Grabby aliens, if Grabby aliens had come here in the past, we couldn't be here now. They would have taken Earth and everything around us and used it for their purposes. And that would be noticeable.
When you say they also change things, is there any potential that Grabby aliens could have visited? And let's use an example, and this goes a little bit Ancient Aliens-esque, but the classic one is aliens built the pyramids, and we don't have to get into that conversation. That's for other shows and whatnot. But is it possible they could have come here and interfered in a way that did benefit them, and they're no longer here?
Of course, that would be possible, but that wouldn't be consistent with the kind of Grabby aliens we're thinking of. So think of, in the United States, say, as Europeans spread across the West, right? They weren't just taking some notes as they went along and maybe composing a song or two and leaving some markers. They made farms. They cut down trees. They made roads, airports. I mean, buildings, cities, right? That is, they changed things because those new versions were more useful to them. And so if aliens had come here doing that, we would presumably see a lot more differences, like changing a monument on Earth or two over the course of the last 10,000 years would be a pretty minor effect, right? We're talking big things, like taking apart the moon. That's the kind of big thing we're talking about.
Okay, I'm following you now. And the difference between those loud and quiet civilizations is quite vast. Is there a moment within a civilization's development that it can almost decide to be a louder civilization, or is it something that can just happen? What's the deal there?
So presumably every civilization starts out quiet, and then they may make a transition to becoming loud. And almost by definition, once they become loud, they can't become quiet again. That is, a loud civilization would be spread out across a wide space with lots of different parts. And even if some of the parts, say, chose to become quiet again, the other parts would continue on to be loud, and they would continue to grow and spread, and the whole thing would continue to be loud. So then the question is, will there be a point in time where our descendants choose in some way to become loud or not? And I do think that's probably the biggest choice our descendants will face in the long run. And I'm trying to write a book about that idea.
That's very interesting. Would you say that we're in the very early stages of trying to be loud, sending probes out into the universe?
It's too early for us to be able to become loud. That is, probably the key moment is when we're possible to send an interstellar colony out, which could then reproduce itself. Once that happens on any substantial scale, then the cat's out of the bag, and it would be too late to stop it. But before any colonies have been sent out, then it's still possible to stop that.
And again, is that talking about steps way beyond us sending a few people to Mars, for example?
Absolutely. That is, you have to go to other stars, and you have to send something there that when it gets there could start a new civilization there. That's a lot more than just a metal box that takes some pictures.
Interesting. Do you think in sending out these probes and radio waves that we do to the solar system, do you think that's a wise idea? Announcing ourselves to the universe at large?
I would be cautious about that, but my Grabby Aliens analysis says it probably won't hurt. Once you see the conclusions of our analysis, I'll just tell you, we basically estimate that intelligent aliens that can become grabby and that do become grabby appear roughly once per million galaxies. And they are at the moment filling up roughly half the universe. We can't see them because they're expanding at almost the speed of light. And once we get into a similar mode, we would meet them in roughly 1 billion years. That's the parameters we're talking about. So the nearest ones, according to this theory, are a really long way away.
Now, those advanced aliens that are expanding, there's a quote at the top of the page if you go to grabbyaliens.com, which says, "Advanced aliens really are out there, and we have enough data to say roughly where they are in space and time and when we will see or meet them." That's a very confident statement. What makes you so confident that, that especially those first words, advanced aliens really are out there?
So it's a more likely than not level of confidence, which I think is news. It's not a 99.99% level of confidence, just to be clear. I'd say what we have is a 3-parameter model where each of the parameters is fit to data and where we have a key piece of data that suggests you need to believe in this model. And that key piece of data is our current date. So to elaborate, if you just think about advanced life like us appearing on a planet like ours, or any sort of planet, we have a simple statistical model that we can use to predict when that would happen in the history of the universe. The simple statistical model says that it's more likely to happen on long-lived planets and much more likely to happen near the end of the lifetime of those planets. In fact, there's a power law that suggests, toward the last 10% or something. Most stars in the universe will last for trillions of years. The average lifespan is like 5 trillion years. So the average planet lifetime is like 5 trillion years. We are now at 14 billion years, a tiny fraction of that average time. So the simple theory we have about when advanced life should appear would be trillions of years in the future. But here we are appearing very early. That says something is wrong about that simple analysis. And we say the key thing that we think is wrong is that that analysis assumes the universe would sit and stay empty and wait until some advanced life finally appeared. We say that instead, advanced life is popping up all the time right now and is filling the universe. And within a billion or so years, it'll all be full. And then it's too late to appear. So we had to appear now early because we had to appear before the deadline. You can only appear before the deadline. And that's why we are here now. But that's why we have to believe they're out there right now. The clock date, the date on the clock with respect to the universe is the piece of evidence that tells you they're out there. Because otherwise we wouldn't be here now. We'd be here much later.
And those advanced civilizations, again, you mentioned it's towards the end of their planet's potentially habitable time. Would it be then that it was necessity that potentially drives these civilizations to expanding out into the stars as much as it would be technological capabilities?
So the key assumption is just some fraction of civilizations do expand. So we don't need really to say why. We can say some things about why. The simplest reason why they might expand is that they do not have a center that controls them. So if they are decentralized, composed of many parts, then if any one part expands, the net effect is expansion. So in order to not expand, they merely need to prevent all of their parts from expanding. And the more advanced they are, the more parts those are. And early on, there might be 10 parts, any which could do it. Later on, there might be 1 trillion parts, any which could do it. So the simplest story about why expansion would happen is just because it only takes one part to make it happen. If our descendants, say, fill the solar system with a vast economy, and it only takes one part in 1 trillion of that economy to send off a probe to another star, and that's enough to start this expansion, this colonization wave, then in order for it not to happen, our civilization has to find a way to prevent any part from doing that. And so that's the simplest reason why they might. Now, of course, they might want to and then choose to, or they might want not to, but just fail to work hard enough to prevent it. But it's really hard to prevent it once you're big enough.
Now, I heard you use the example and discuss about Panspermia Siblings.
Yes.
And you've mentioned the word descendants there. Can you just tell us about the term Panspermia Siblings and what that could mean?
Well, so the key idea is in our simple Grabby Aliens model, the nearest aliens are far away. They appear once per million galaxies. And that makes it crazy unlikely that there's anybody nearby. So in order to actually make it believable that there are aliens nearby, we need to change this model to create correlation so that aliens appear near each other. And a simple way to produce correlation is to say we have siblings. That is, life started in our galaxy on some other planet, other solar system, many long ago. So our sun started roughly 4.5 billion years ago, and that's when our Earth started. But since the universe is 14 billion years, that was almost 10 billion years after the start of the universe. So you might say, well, 5 billion years after the start of the universe, say, some other star was formed, and around that, some other planet, an Eden, and life started on that planet 10 billion years ago. And then life evolved on that planet for maybe 5 billion years. And then some rock flew down, smashed into that planet, smashed up some other rocks into the sky, and some of those pieces of rocks had life on them. And those rocks drifted and then landed in the stellar nursery that our sun was born in. So all stars are basically born in nurseries, whole clumps of hundreds and thousands of stars, all born at the same place in the same time, close together. And if this rock had flown into our stellar nursery, then not only could it have landed on Earth and seeded life on Earth, but there were so many rocks flying around so close to each other right then that it plausibly would have then seeded many other stars and the planets around them at that same time in that same place. And then over the last 5 billion years, those stars drifted apart and are now spread all around a ring around the galaxy. But that means there's a few thousand other stars out there that might be seeded with life from the same source that we got it, and they would be our Panspermia siblings. And then one of those could have achieved our level of technology before us. And then they would be a plausible source where aliens might be coming from to visit us, while still explaining why the rest of the universe looks completely empty. So if we're going to try to explain how it is that there might be aliens visiting us now, we have a number of puzzling things to explain. One of which is, if there's aliens out there that close to us in space and time, why isn't the universe full of them? Why does everything look so dead and empty? So one way to do that is to create this correlation. Yes, life appears very rarely, but it appears in little chunks, or life is in several places at the same time and place because it has a common origin. So Panspermia siblings would be a key hypothesis we would need to invoke to explain, say, UFOs as aliens. The idea that even though we look out and we see all this dead, empty universe, millions and trillions of galaxies all empty, as far as we can see now, that's consistent with there being aliens near us now because they had a common origin with us. And so there aren't very many of them. There's just maybe one. Maybe in the next million galaxies, there's just this one other alien civilization, the ones that are visiting.
And you also discussed the idea that if that was the case, potentially these civilizations, albeit having the ability to travel, could be coming to other quiet civilizations and encouraging us to stay quiet.
Well, so we have to ask, what else do we need to assume to make this hypothesis work? So first of all, we assume Panspermia siblings. Secondly, we assume that one of those planets achieved our level of civilization before us. From that, we have to guess it's probably at least 100 million years ago that happened. And so they've been at our level of technology for 100 million years within our same galaxy. And right there, that makes a problem, which is it would have only taken them 1 million years at most to fill our galaxy and change it all if they had been so inclined. But by assumption, they didn't do that. So we'll need to add to the scenario one more element, which is they chose not to. They, for some reason, decided not to expand and fill the galaxy and change it. They had an ecological or religious or other concerns. We can talk about that more if you want, why a civilization might not want to allow expansion, but they chose not to allow their civilization to expand. And they succeeded at that actually pretty difficult task. Yet they survived. So one way to succeed is just kill themselves. And they did not kill themselves. They did not expand. They succeeded at keeping themselves limited and preventing this vast expansion and change. That's something else we'll have to assume about them in order to make the scenario work. Panspermia siblings plus a anti-growth, policy of the aliens. But once we assume that they were anti-growth, then for free, we get an explanation for why they're here, right? Because they have this policy against growth. They have been preventing people going out from their own civilization to cause growth. And now they see us in their telescopes and they can draw the conclusion we might violate their rule. We are on a path to choosing to expand. That might be one of the things we do. And if they have this rule that prevents them from expanding, then they will want this rule applied to us. They want us to not expand as well. Otherwise, we make irrelevant their rule if we don't follow the same rule. So then we get an explanation for why they are here. They made an exception for their general policy of expanding. I mean, wherever they came from, it's a long way to come here. They surely can't be allowing very many trips like that, or that would risk breaking their rule, right? Any one vacationing trip along the way could somehow, go rogue and fill the universe. So they must not allow very many vacationing trips from their origins, right? But this one expedition, they have apparently allowed. And this would be a reason. This is an unusual priority because unless they come here, they may not, succeed in keeping this rule. Now, we can also conclude they had a simple way to make this rule be enforced, is just to destroy us. No doubt, 100 million years more advanced than us, that would have been easy. They could have just sent something here to blow us up, wipe us out, full stop, right? So, but we can look around and say, we are not destroyed. So we can add one more thing we know about them. They are reluctant to just kill us off. They'd rather we adopted this policy voluntarily, without muss or fuss or struggle. So they're here to persuade us, not just force us, to follow their rule.
And is there a hypothesis as to why that would be? Because as a species, we always think about advancement and growth, and we want to get to this planet, and then from that planet to this, outside the solar system, then into other, as you say, interstellar travel would be an incredible dream to achieve. Why would a civilization, in your opinion, what's the hypothesis that they would get to a point and think, no, we have to stop here?
Well, we can already now see when people discuss this idea of interstellar colonization, many of us have doubts and concerns and advise against it. That's something we already see now. So we don't have to hypothesize it. We can just ask, why are people now warning us against allowing expansion? So there's several different reasons. So one is that this expansion would continue competition and conflict. And that would produce evolution. And so our descendants in this process would change. They would no longer be like us. So you might dislike this idea that our distant descendants would become very different from us. You could think they are then aliens and of no value, and think that we should disown them. And you might think, well, we want to prevent our descendants from becoming so alien. And so one way to do that would be to control reproduction and prevent expansion. So we may want to both limit who could leave the solar system and also limit the kind of changes that can happen here within the solar system. People are already thinking about, some people say, let's become transhumanist, let's change our minds and change our body. And other people are saying, no, that would be terrible. Let's make laws against those sorts of changes. But you couldn't enforce laws against those changes unless you also limited where people could go, because otherwise they could just go far away and then change there. And then after they change there, they would come back here and contest with us about control over here. And a related thing is just this idea that we have, over time, been acquiring more of a world mob or world community that has suppressed competition and war and conflict in many ways that people enjoy and approve. So, thousands of years ago, the world was full of warring empires, with enormous destruction, constantly fighting each other. And in the last century, we have created more of a world community. And now we actually substantially suppress conflict, suppress war, but we also suppress many kinds of business competition. Regulations of business are pretty similar worldwide. Regulation of telecommunications and nuclear energy and transportation and a wide range of other things are actually pretty much the same the whole world over in ways that greatly limit changes in those areas to many people's satisfaction. They like the idea that we aren't allowing organ sales, or we aren't allowing just rogue nuclear reactors, etc., around the world. And people will, in the future, even more like what we've done with the world governance and the world mobs that we have created. Even today, people are talking about how we could deal with inequality, how we could deal with global warming if we have enough world community and world coordination. And we will succeed more of that, and we will have more of that coordination. And all of that would be at risk as soon as colonists leave here for other stars. We would no longer be able to have a civilization-wide governance that imposes its will on all of us. We would then have competitors who leave out to distant stars and a few thousand years later come back with new technologies, new ways of thinking, and contest with us for our control over here.
So it's almost like a fragile ecosystem or fragile hierarchy there, where, as you say, they don't want to see us have that change that we could then change them or impose ourselves on another civilization. But again, hopefully I'm thinking about this the right way. If one of those civilizations, again, wanted us to stay quiet, how would we, as a younger civilization and far more naive and less advanced, know to trust that persuasiveness? Because, like you say, they're reluctant to destroy us, but how might
Right?
that look that you have to then trust?
Well, so the key question is, they're here to persuade us. How do they plan to persuade us? What is their persuasion strategy? And this is where I think I'll add the third element of my hypothesis to explain UFOs as aliens. So remember the first part, there is Panspermia siblings out there, one of which have reached our level before us. The second part is they chose a non-growth strategy and had a rule internally against that, which explains why they're here. And of course, they also are reluctant to destroy us because they haven't. And now we have to ask, okay, but what's their plan? How will they convince us then to not expand? And here I'm going to go on a very common observation among social species is that pretty much all social species have a status hierarchy, a pecking order. There's the high and the low. And a very common feature is the low defer to the high. The low copy the high. The high are in charge. The low go along. This is very robust across animal species here on Earth, and we might postulate that it's also robust among animal species where they came from. So their strategy is simply to be our high. So the way humans have domesticated most other animals that we have domesticated is that they have a status hierarchy and we have just slipped in as the top of their hierarchy. The way we domesticate dogs is we convince the dogs we are the top dog. And that's why they should do what we say. It's a very common standard strategy to domesticate a species. You become their top dog. So that's the alien strategy. They are going to domesticate us by being our highest status members. So the simple strategy is to be here, not out there. If they did very impressive things way out there in the universe, they would be them and not us. So they have to be part of us. They have to be here. And then they just have to be more impressive than the rest of us. So, all through history, even in human civilization, if the emperor wants you to convince them to bow down and obey the emperor, then the emperor just has to be more impressive than you in a great many ways. A bigger palace, a bigger chariot, bigger crown, bigger entourage, handsome, strong, knowledgeable, witty. They just have to be the top, right? So the alien strategy is to come here and be our top, say, to be the most impressive thing around that we can see. Now, they have one key problem with this. So if you think about how humans have reacted to other foreign civilizations, most other foreign civilizations on Earth are still pretty similar to us. They're the same species, they're only a little bit different. But nevertheless, we have often found ways to be horrified by the small differences that exist. And that's a problem. So a foreigner who comes and tries to be the top of your civilization, that's a problem if we see them as the foreigner instead of as one of us. And so the aliens have a simple fix for that, which is not to show much about them. If they were to land on the White House lawn and start to talk a lot about their civilization, where they came from and how they do things and their various customs and principles, we would almost surely find something we hated. Maybe they eat babies, who knows?
Yeah.
To them, it's not a problem. To us, it's terrible, right? They can't predict which things we'll hate, but they can be pretty sure that if they tell us a lot of things, we're going to hate a couple of them. And then the whole plan is off, right? Then we're not going to see them as the top one of us, and we're going to reject them. So they have to be here, be really impressive, but not reveal very much about themselves. So this is the explanation then for why they hang out at the edge of our vision, because there's this key puzzle that many people have noted about this idea that UFOs might be aliens. Look, if they're 100 million years more advanced than us, then they could have either A, made themselves really obvious and visible, landing on the White House lawn, putting out a hand, talking, being really impressive, just being really obvious. That would have been really possible. Or they could have been completely invisible. There's no reason why, if they wanted to track and observe us, they would need to be at all visible in the sky. They could have some completely black satellites orbiting hundreds of miles above that we would never see. With powerful telescopes, they could observe pretty much anything they wanted down here. There's no reason for them to be flashing around in the sky in ways that we would see. So one last puzzle about UFOs as aliens is, why are they hanging out at the edge of our vision? Somewhat visible, but not very visible, showing a few things about themselves, but not much. And the hypothesis here is that's because this is their safest strategy for being our top dog. Eventually, we'll be convinced they're there, we'll be really impressed, and we can figure out their agenda just from that. They don't need to tell us anything. You and I have just discussed. We can figure out why they're here. We can figure out what they want.
Let me ask, because that's really, really interesting, and I often use analogies about fish when I talk about, aliens, UFOs, sightings, and how that might work with two different species. The assumption is that we're technologically advanced enough to this higher civilization that they feel comfortable that they can have a level of communication. But, for example, we wouldn't compare ourselves to a fish in the ocean, and a fish would see the bottom of a boat at being on the edge of their sight, and they see the kind of shimmering light around the boat and the bottom of the boat, having no comprehension of what's on the boat, the species on the boat, or what they're doing or why they're there. Is it possible that these UFOs that we do see in the sky, and let's for a moment assume we are seeing, let's go with the classic flying saucer, shiny bright lights, all that kind of stuff. Is it possible that we're so inefficiently advanced to these other civilizations that are visiting here potentially that they see us in the same way we would see a fish? So to them, we're not announcing ourselves to the fish. We just happen to be at the top of the ocean, and these other saucers and other craft are here because they just see a planet, and we're so far down the pecking order, so to speak, that we're not even at the point of being the dog to be stroked and domesticated, and we're just something else inhabiting this planet.
So the more you know, the more ways you can be puzzled. A young child looks at strange things and doesn't know they're strange and isn't puzzled. It's when you have stronger expectations that then things become puzzling and even unlikely seeming. So when you're constructing a scenario, you have to look at the whole scenario in order to see how plausible it is. So if you just say, assume they are really advanced, so advanced they don't care much about us, and then you ask, would they be, communicating with us or explaining themselves to us? You might say, no, given that assumption, that particular implication isn't problematic. However, that assumption is problematic with respect to other things we see. So the key point is, if there were aliens so common in the universe that they just happen to be here at the moment, then they would pretty much happen to be everywhere. And if they were that common that they happen to be everywhere, then why does it all look so empty? Why is the universe so unused, so dead? Aliens that were that common and had any substantial aspirations to do stuff, well, they would have been doing stuff a long time ago, and they would have done a lot. And then when we looked up, we would see a lot, right? So, look, if you show up in the middle of a city and stand on a corner, you shouldn't be surprised if everybody just walks past you and nobody says hi. But you should notice that you're in a city. It would look different than if you were in the middle of the ocean or in the forest or in a desert. The city would look different. That would be your clue that there was something going on. Not their interest in you, not how they communicated with you, but just the stuff you saw around you. So our first thing we need to explain is, why does the universe look so empty and dead? And of course, the simplest explanation of that is because it is empty and dead. There isn't anybody else out there, right? And now we say, oh, but there's some aliens visiting, and now we've got a problem. Because now we're postulating both that there are advanced creatures who are capable of enormous things and perhaps have enormous ambitions, and yet everything's dead and empty. That's the puzzle.
And I suppose that's where the conversation, many would take down the route of alternate dimensions, different realities.
That doesn't help. Like, fine, there's other places they could go, but here's a place. Why aren't they here doing stuff with this stuff?
Is that not, though, again, it's not part of your model, obviously, but I'm curious, why is that problematic? Because to many people who listen to this podcast have got different opinions on where these things may be from, and to many it's now too simple to expect aliens coming from Mars, for example, and people talk about higher beings, levels of consciousness. Why is that problematic to things?
Maybe I'm not understanding you, but if you look at life on Earth and you go to a desert and you say, why is this desert empty of life? Well, first of all, you look closely, it isn't empty, but to a first cut, it looks kind of empty, right? Now you might say, well, because the life that could have come to the desert, it's now in the Amazon. Well, that's not an answer, because the point is life spreads everywhere it can go. Wherever life started, it went to the Amazon, and it went to the ocean, and it went to the poles, and it went to the mountains, right? You look in any one place and you don't say, why is there no life here? An explanation is because it wanted to go elsewhere, because life just goes everywhere it can. It doesn't choose one place to go, it goes everywhere. So if you look at a place on Earth, you have to say, because life can't go here. That has to be the reason why you don't see life here, is because it just couldn't get here. It can't thrive here. It's too hot, too dry, too cold, whatever it is. It can't work here. That's your explanation for life on Earth. So that would similarly have to be the explanation for a dead, empty universe. You can't say, well, life isn't here because it decided to go somewhere else. Life would decide to go everywhere it could. If this is a place it could go and it's not here, you have to say, why didn't life go here?
Let me ask, on these different sightings that people have, and I know you've said before that you don't look at specific reports and you would have to look at atmospheric phenomena and various other aspects of different sightings, but people do report seeing various different shapes of objects. Some of them being bright and shiny, classic flying saucers. You hear about triangles, battleship-sized craft. The more common or newer object discussed, especially with the Navy pilots, have been tic-tac shaped objects or maybe classic cigar shapes. Would that suggest to you, I know these objects you've described as puzzling, that they are all of different origin? Or do you think that these objects, not necessarily assuming they're coming from far away or that far away, that they are all of the same origin but for different purposes?
Again, the key thing is to generate a whole scenario and then ask how believable is that entire scenario. So given that there would be multiple origins, of course, it wouldn't be puzzling that they look different, but it is puzzling that there would be multiple origins. Because remember, if the universe is dead and empty, that's at odds with it all being full of life. So one way to solve that is the Panspermia Siblings, where there's only a small number of other aliens out there, maybe only one, and then they're here. The more other ones there are, the more puzzling this gets, right? Yeah. So what if you postulate there's 100 Panspermia siblings, right? Well, now you have to imagine this first civilization going out and taming all of them and making sure they all follow the rule. But somehow this rule that they're all following is allowing them all to visit here. How are they going to enforce this rule if they're allowing that many different visitors to go that many different places? You see the problem? That is, each new place that shows up, they need to send somebody there to make sure they follow the rules, but they don't need a whole bunch of different people all, doing different things going there. That seems a recipe for breaking the rules. If you allow that many different exceptions, you're not going to keep this thing going for 100 million years. Remember, that's what we're postulating. They chose to not expand, to not allow any part of them to do that. They lasted for 100 million years, and they succeeded in preventing any part of them from doing that. If there are now other alien civilizations out there that appeared between the first and us, they would have to make sure all of them followed the rule. But that has to mean not very many things going around and doing stuff, which means the minimal strategy for dealing with us would just be to have one group come to us. So it makes much more sense then that this one group is just expressing itself with different shapes than that these shapes are coming from different places, because it's just hard to believe that you would allow this many different places to come here in order to explain this idea that there's just one group that wants to stop us.
And as you say, it's still the idea that if there were multiple groups, there's still going to be a hierarchy, because there would have been that first group that's always going to be further ahead and more advanced.
It somehow would have made sure the other ones followed the rule and then created some integrated policing structure that guaranteed that. And that would be pretty hard. But that's what we have to postulate, to look up in the universe and say, it's all empty. Nobody's doing anything that we can see. How does that make any sense? So again, the key idea is any one piece can make sense, but when you put all the pieces together, then they can have conflicts with each other when you're trying to create a scenario that makes sense.
let me ask you, Robin, in the time we've got left, because you've been really generous so far, and I really do hope to yourself and the listeners I've managed to make some sense of the conversation. It's a fascinating discussion, and hopefully I've kept up my end to some degree with you, Robin. I want to ask about the James Webb images we saw the other day. I think it's very timely given what you talk about and what the paper proposes, that we've just seen some incredible images dating back 13 billion years into the universe. What were your first thoughts when you saw those images?
Well, pretty. With respect to aliens, in our analysis of Grabby Aliens, what we say is that how many alien civilizations you might expect to see out there depends on this key parameter of how fast they expand. If they would expand slowly, then we should see hundreds of vast alien spheres of control out there in the universe. If they expand fast enough, then we should expect to see 0 of them. But even if we only saw 1 or 2, the model predicts they would be enormous in the sky, much larger than the full moon. So that means you don't really need to look a long way off at fine details to distinguish these theories. If you want to say, are the aliens out there expanding fast or slow? You just say, do I see any enormous spheres in the sky that look different than the regions around them? And for that, again, even our naked eye is good enough as long as we're looking in the right sort of frequencies to tell the difference. So here you've got this enormously sophisticated telescope that can look even more finely all the way across the universe in very tiny angular scales. But we don't need that in order to judge this basic fact: are there enormous spheres in the sky or not? So for the basic purpose of figuring out where we are in the universe and what the aliens are like, the detail this telescope is showing us isn't very relevant. It's pretty, and hopefully we'll learn a lot of other things about the nature of galaxies and the natures of other things. One of the things they showed is, oxygen in the atmosphere of a planet a few hundred light years away. And that's interesting from the point of view of asking how many planets out there might have life on them at very early stages. But the key thing we know is that, there is almost no vast civilizations out there. So the more planets we see what plausibly have life in earlier stages, then the more we have to expect difficulties later on in the process. Because the one thing we can be pretty confident of is getting to our level or even a bit further is extremely rare. So there has to be what I've called a great filter, some process that makes it very difficult to go from simple dead matter all the way up to where we are, and then all the way to be very visible in the universe. So if we actually saw, say, oxygen in the atmosphere of a planet such that we believe that was because of life on that planet, well, that suggests that the great filter is not at the very first stage of having life exist at all. It's at some later stage in the process before you get to where we are. And you have to worry then it's after where we are. That is, what we look up as we see no huge civilizations out there, but we're not quite there yet. And there could be more obstacles between where we are and to get to that stage. And in order to sort of save the theory that it's easy going from here on, you have to believe that all the tough going was in the past. But the more you see earlier stages where it doesn't look so hard, the more you have to worry that the tough going is in our future. And that's bad news.
You mentioned that James Webb isn't necessarily going to show us those things that we could be looking for much closer to home. The Galileo Project, is that something you're aware of that's spearheaded by Avi Loeb?
I know that there's some project to just take pictures in our atmosphere of unusual phenomena and then maybe catch something interesting. So that's what we're talking about?
Yes, they're looking to put up several different telescopes and different equipment around the planet, various different places.
Seems like a relatively cheap way to maybe find something interesting. I'm happy to support it. But, the key under the scenario that I've talked about, they're going to adjust to our behavior to still stay at the edge of our visibility. So the prediction would be we would get more confident that there's something really there going on, but we wouldn't actually learn that much more about them. We would just learn they really are there. Because under this hypothesis, they're trying to convince us they're there and that they're impressive, but not reveal very much more. And then that's what we could hopefully learn, to be finally convinced they really are there. And they really are accelerating in enormous, capabilities. They really have amazing things we can't do. They really deserve to be seen as our top dog.
It's dangling the carrot on the treadmill, or I don't suppose you want the carrot on the treadmill, probably the chocolate bar if you're running towards a treat. But like you say, it's always just one step too far ahead of us, and it's always going to be there that they show us what we need to see, but not necessarily what we want to see. Would that be right?
Well, they don't want to show us many details. Again, anything we would hate. Can't let us see them eating babies or whatever it is.
Okay.
So they're not going to send us the galactic encyclopedia of their history, right? Not going to hand us, technology for fusion, right? Unless they can do that without saying much. But under this hypothesis, we would eventually be convinced, yeah, it's really going on. It's really there. It's really happening. And that's worth knowing. But so interestingly, under this hypothesis, they don't think they're in much of a rush to persuade us of this. They got a lot of time. So therefore, we're not almost at this point where they're worried about us, right? So presumably, they've got a button somewhere. And if we get too uppity, they push the button and we're gone. And
the reset button.
Yeah, well, thing that erases us. If we got too threatening to them, too capable of, say, finding them and destroying them or expanding without them being able to stop us, then before we got to that point, they would be able to just stop us, right? So that has to be true. They have to have such a thing ready. And plausibly, they don't think we're close. They're not in a rush, right? Because otherwise they would be a little more aggressive about showing themselves to make sure we saw them, right? And they're not that aggressive. They're hanging out at the edge, and they seem to be okay with that. They seem to be okay with letting it take us a while to figure it out.
And another effort I want to get your thoughts on that's just been announced recently was NASA's own independent study into UFOs. How do you see that playing out, and is that potentially something, again, that could bear any fruit?
So, I'm a futurist in many ways, and in the futurist world, there's a lot of people who pay attention to every new news release about somebody who's got some new thing that might be a new gadget, right? And I tend to think, look, if you're going to focus on long time scales, that don't get lost in everyday's news fluctuations. Look at the long-term trends and focus on that. So similarly, I would say, look, if you think that UFOs might be aliens, we're talking a long-term game here, a long-term situation. We've gone at least 70 years with people making reports. It's mostly been treated skeptically. Opinion is evolving only very slowly. At the moment, among most, prestigious intellectuals, it's still pretty taboo. It's still pretty ridiculed. That's likely to stay that way for a while. It may slowly change and come over, but you're talking many decades. We're not talking, next year. So I think you just have to think of this as an interesting fluctuation in the short term that might, push things a bit in the right direction in the long term, but you can't get too excited about each short-term fluctuation, right? Because again, this is a long game. We've had 100,000 UFO reports out there written down over the last 70 years. One or two more aren't going to make that much difference. They slowly add another study, another group. It isn't going to make that much difference. Because, I can just tell you from the inside of knowing prestigious intellectuals, especially those in the fields most seen as expertly close to this, it's a strong consensus that this stuff is silly and should just not be taken very seriously. And that's just going to take a long time to change. That's just the facts. So I can't give you very much optimism about fast short-term progress. Sorry.
That's okay. Everyone's allowed their opinion, and that's it. You've put it across really well. I want to ask you just a couple of listener questions to finish off in the time we've got. Question from Matt. He asks, where does religion play a part in your theory?
So I just got a question like this yesterday on a different podcast. Somebody asked about what about all the paranormal stuff reported with UFO reports. So the theory I gave you is a theory where all the usual scientific theories are basically right. And yet, even so, here there are aliens visiting us. And it took a bit of work to put together a scenario like that.
Mm-hmm.
And I would actually say there's a prior probability of 1 in 1,000 on that scenario, which is high enough to be worth looking at the evidence, because, say, in a typical murder trial, the prior might be 1 in a million, that any one person was murdered by any one other associate. So that's my best guess. But now if you want to add into the hypothesis, and we're wrong about a bunch of very basic theories about how things work, there really are ghosts and fairies and ESP, and somehow the aliens find in their interest to use that stuff, I struggle to come up with a hypothesis that makes sense of that, where I don't have to have a much lower probability, right? And so if you throw in some sort of religion hypothesis, I'm going to have to do the same. I'm going to have to say, look, I'm going to buy into the usual scientific consensus theories on most things. And I'm going to try to ask how, within the space of our usual way of thinking of us, could maybe there be aliens around who are looking like UFOs? And I can come up with something like that. I have to do a little work, so I have to give it maybe a 1 in 1,000 prior, which isn't, huge, but it's good enough to make you look at the evidence. But again, if you throw more things into the mix and you say, okay, but now there really is ESP, and now there really are ghosts, and now explain why the aliens want to make us see ghosts. I'm going to go, first of all, I think it's pretty unlikely there are ghosts. And second of all, why would the aliens need to make us see ghosts? I don't get it. How does that achieve their purposes? Like, under this scenario, we know why they're here. They don't want us to expand. The ghost thing doesn't seem to help. So I don't get it, right? So I can't make sense of it. Doesn't mean it might not be true. It just means it's not fitting for me in my most likely scenario I can construct.
And Matt had a follow-up that in that model, is there a room or place for alien abduction to play a part in this, or any kind of alien contact?
Well, again, think about the simplest theory of why they would be here and what's the purpose, right? Their simple purpose is to be our top dog, to convince us that they exist and that they are more impressive than us. So how would abducting people help with that? It looks a lot more risky. They're risking a lot more close contact, a lot more ways we would find details about them. They're doing it in ways that don't make other people believe it very easily, right? They're not like showing up abducting people in Times Square. They're doing it off on the edge. And so I just don't see how it achieves the plausible purpose of impressing us in ways that convince us they exist and that they're friendly and high. So, in fact, also one of the key criteria is they need to not be threatening. And in fact, UFO reports do seem to be consistently not threatening, in terms of they don't seem to run up and attack a fighter plane or something, and they don't destroy things, whereas they obviously could. And that would be one key thing about being our top dog. And when we, of course, are the top dog for horses or dogs, we use a little bit of violence and harm to discipline them, but we make it clear that's just because they're being punished for something. But otherwise, we're mostly their friends and their supporters, and we're trying to help them, right? Well, that's what they would need to be doing with us, seeming to be unthreatening. So the abductions look kind of threatening. They don't look so friendly. This doesn't seem a wise move, right? It doesn't communicate the thing they're trying to communicate, and it doesn't make them seem, friendly. I'm just not seeing how it makes sense as a strategy.
And let me ask one final question from Neumann. I'll ask the question and then I'll give you the context he's given me behind it as well. Neumann asks, what kind of relationships amongst intergalactic empires would the Grabby alien model imply? Would it be similar to intergalactic Cold War or colonial politics? He gives the context of, in ufology, a frequently propagated claim is that Earth is a theatre stage of intergalactic Cold War between different species for the control of our genetic and spiritual development. We've got tall greys, tall whites, and Palladians. If they really exist, the behaviour might stem from them just being Grabby aliens.
So under the Grabby Aliens model, again, this is without Panspermia Siblings. This is just the simple model. They appear roughly once per million galaxies. They expand at near the speed of light, and they keep expanding until they meet each other. And that would be in roughly 1 billion years from now if we did that. At that point, they meet each other, and then they may or may not have conflicts at those borders. But until then, they just are having internal expansion and creation. So by assumption, we are not now within the sphere of control of Grabby Aliens. That is, the point is they would be very visible and obvious. So that means we can't now be within the sphere of conflict of two sets of Grabby Aliens, because that would be even more obvious, right? So the simplest version of this theory says that that's just not applying. Now, we can start to make variations. One variation would be somehow what they're doing in the universe, they're changing things, but somehow in a way it doesn't make a visible difference. Somehow we're just not looking at the right sort of thing to be able to see the difference. Mm-hmm. That's hard for me to believe, but at least that would be a variation you could think of. But now again, by assumption, we would just not at all be powerful enough to be worth fighting over. They could simply come here and take over. If they just arrived here, they could just, in a short time, change everything here to their liking. We have little to offer them in terms of direct power. So now, but there is a way that quiet alien civilizations can serve the purposes of loud ones. So the idea would be there's a lot more quiet ones than loud ones. And loud ones are thinking a lot about what happens when they meet the other loud. And they want to collect data about what are all civilizations like, because they're trying to guess what will these aliens be like when we meet them. And they're going to be really eager for data like that. And when they finally meet one other Grabby alien civilization, they will, at that point in space-time, they will have never met any others before. So their only data they have about aliens is the quiet ones they meet along the way. They may come across the ruins of quiet ones, or quiet ones that are just long-lived but stay very local. And that data would be very valuable to them. They want to know what are quiet alien civilizations like as a way to guess what will these Grabby ones be like when we meet them. That isn't necessarily consistent with them being peaceful. They may come and disassemble everyone and take all the data that way. But still, they would, the quiet alien civilizations per gram or something would just be much more valuable as data than just as raw material to make stuff. Because again, moving across billions of light years to finally meet aliens, they will have vast stars and planets and everything to use to do things, but they'll only meet maybe a couple quiet alien civilizations. And those would then be enormously valuable as data. So if for some reason some Grabby alien civilization came past here and is expanding out and somehow we didn't notice them, the thing we would conclude is that they study us very carefully, not because they're afraid of us, not because we can do much for them, just because we're their best data about these strange aliens they're going to meet in the future. They just want to know, what are aliens like?
It would certainly put us in our intergalactic place in the universe, wouldn't it, to know that we were just a data sample for some other species that was so much further
in addition
evolved.
to a data sample, we can also be a coordination point. So this is kind of interesting. When two Grabby alien civilizations meet, they may have both gotten data from the same quiet alien civilizations. So those quiet alien civilizations could be a coordination point when they want to know, what should we expect them to think? We can say, well, they saw the same quiet one we did. So this quiet one could create common expectations about what we should both expect to happen when we meet. And so we quiet alien civilizations could serve that purpose, to not just give one an expectation, but give them both simultaneously the expectation of what are aliens like. We could be their main idea of what each other are like. They might each assume the other one is like us.
That's a fascinating idea. I want to finish just that you mentioned you're writing a book currently. If you could give us a little bit of information on the book and obviously when we can expect that to be released, if you've got that information to hand.
If there's no date even for releasing, it's still being written. But the idea is, we talked about why people might want to stay as a quiet alien civilization and how difficult that might be. And therefore, how this would be the biggest choice we might face in the future, is whether or not to stay quiet or whether to become loud. And so, being as that's such an important question, I wanted to frame that question and make it vivid. That is, I want to set up the context of Grabby Aliens and quiet versus loud aliens and our future and the things that might happen to us if we compete or allow ourselves to change, and the kinds of coordinations that we might like to do, to set up and make vivid this choice we will have between staying quiet and becoming loud. And I may have an opinion that we should become loud, but it's not my place to beat you over the head with my opinion. This is a choice that may not be made for thousands of years. And later on, when it is made, they will know much more than we do now. So my opinion is less important than setting up the question to say, let's start thinking about this question. Let's start collecting opinions and collecting considerations to prepare us for the day when we may someday want to make this choice.
Robin, it's been fascinating speaking with you. I really hope I've managed to do it justice. It's breath of fresh air to discuss different ideas from a different perspective as well, and the model certainly is interesting. And when that book is released, it'd be great to have you on to talk about it back on the podcast.
Be happy to come.
And if anyone's got any follow-up questions for Robin, I do believe you'll be speaking to Dan Zetterstrom down the line for Colouring Outside the Lines. I think he was arranging an interview with you for some time in the near future. So that's something people could get in touch with Dan about if they've got any follow-ups, as it'll be a different type of conversation he has with you.
I have generally just been accepting all invitations to do conversations like this. So if anybody has invited me, I've probably said yes.
Yeah, I think you have. But yeah, any questions, send them over to Dan, and he will certainly get those in there for you. Robin, it's been a pleasure speaking with you.
Nice talking to you.
That is all for this week's show. Thank you very much for listening. Please remember to leave the podcast a review on your chosen platform. You can like, retweet and subscribe. That would all be very much appreciated. The shows are being uploaded onto YouTube as we speak more and more. You can sign up at patreon.com/That UFO podcast to access the shows ad-free as well. Please get in touch on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, That UFO podcast. Of course, on Twitter, it's at UFO UAPAM. And again, folks, as always, keep looking up. You never know what you might see.
It wasn't a tic-tac and not quite a saucer, more like a hubcap designed by Chaucer, a little Baroque and quite steampunk, like Alice was playing bass for the Parliament of Folk. The little fucker hovered right outside of my window, and when I shoved out the screen, he made it an issue. I don't think he expected me to see his ass, but I'd had some champagne and smoked a little grass. Meditative game of state full on meta. Can't imagine how it could have been any better. I got to the top of the stairs and there he was. Like, you awake? I was about to abduct you, cuz. I jumped back and nearly kissed myself, and I climbed out the window after the elf, and I woke up in my bed and there was something on my head and everything was weird and everything was red. And I called out to my boys. They thought this was noise. They thought it was a dream. They thought it was my toys. They thought it was my problems, and they think I should seek therapy, and I don't know what to do because it doesn't really scare me. If you really want to know who I think I be, I think it's you and me and us and we and him and her and that and she and that thing over there and what's that, Jake? If we're being serious, open your mind, consider your heart, consider time, consider your space, consider your lies, consider your life, consider your eyes. It wasn't a tic-tac and not quite a saucer. It wasn't a tic-tac and not quite a saucer.